So my name is Sarah Avanza, and I serve as the director of the Cornell Alliance for Science. And today I want to welcome you to our inaugural live. Here at the Alliance for Science, we hope everyone, wherever you may be in the world, is safe and healthy in these times of challenge and uncertainty. Today, we're launching our newest initiative, Alliance for Science Live, a regular webinar series that will bring together voices from around the globe to engage in discussions around food, agriculture, and science. Today, we'll hear directly from 3 of our African correspondents about their reporting around the ground in Africa. Later this week, we'll hear about the rise of the anti-science movement in Brazil, and the conversations continue next week and beyond. Alliance for Science Live allows us to connect as a global community, discuss tough issues, hear diverse sessions, moderated by our very own managing editor, Joan Conroe. Enjoy. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you, Sarah. It's good to see you and everybody here. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. The Alliance for Science hires regional correspondents to ensure that our reporting about Africa comes to you straight from the source. So today we've got 3 of those correspondents here joining us from Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana to tell us what's happening there during this global pandemic. So let me introduce you to our correspondents, and at this time we'll do a little sound check with them as they say hi. So first we've got Nkechi Isaac, who's in Nigeria. Good, hello Nkechi.
Hello, Joanne.
Great.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. You're coming through loud. We've also got Bernardo Meme in Nairobi, Kenya.
Hello, Joanne.
Hello, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you.
And we've got Joseph Apoku Gakpo reporting to us from Ghana. Good morning.
Hi there. Good day. I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, good. Seems like we're all loud and clear. Great. All right, so let's start with Nkechi. And why don't you give us just a little update on what's happening in Nigeria right now in regard to COVID? Are you still under lockdown? Are your borders closed? What's the status of things now?
So with the coronavirus pandemic that we are trying to battle, when we had the first case that was recorded, the federal government issued a lockdown. The first one was a 4 weeks lockdown to allow people, the government, to have a firm grasp of the situation. So we had the schools shut, we had the shops shut, the borders were closed, commercial flights were stopped for the 4 weeks, and afterwards we had another 4 weeks to help government stop the spread of the rapid spread of the virus. But with things looking up, we had from April to last night, we've moved from 1 case in the beginning of the year, which was February, till now we have over 16,000. So, but now things are beginning to look up because we are beginning to have a gradual ease of the lockdown. Now, the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 had issued some directives that will now allow worship centers to open. They allow civil servants who from grade 14 upwards can go to work, but the junior servants have to stay out till they get further directive. Then we also have the gradual ease of the lockdown in the markets. Prior to now, we had markets under lockdown. We only make use of the corner shops around the neighborhoods. But now, beginning to, with government feeling they are now having a grasp of the situation, they have also opened up the markets. Now we have, even though it's not every day, we have 2 days of the week. They go to market on Mondays, on Wednesdays, and on Saturdays. The people allowed to trade now are the people who sell essential things like foodstuff. And then the market opens from 10 a.m. till around 4 p.m. Then now financial institutions, which we are shut before, has also been opened. Now you can go to bank, although they are running, before now it was not full scale, but now they have started running the 9 to 2 p.m. So things are getting back to normal here in Nigeria. That's basically the summary of what's going on right now in Nigeria.
Okay, it's good to hear that things are easing up a little bit there. I'm sure everybody's happy to have things turn a little bit more to normal. Mimi, how about you? Tell us a little bit about what's the situation there in Nairobi and the rest of Kenya in terms of, are you still under lockdown? Are things moving? Is there testing? What's going on there? Mimi, you might want to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, just similar as Nkechi, we had a lockdown since the first case was reported. The first case in Kenya was reported in mid-March, and immediately the government closed schools, schools, markets, some markets, and also there was a closure of worship centers and so forth. So since the first encounter, and the government took that initiative of closing such essential services, Kenyans tried to grapple with the new directives. Most people who have been affected were people who are in informal settlements, for example, slums. Maintaining social distance was very difficult. It was a huge task for them. But as things continued, people started taking their own initiatives to combat the virus. We saw several innovations of Kenyans. For example, a 9-year-old innovated hand washing machine, which the Kenyan government, through the president, recognized that innovation. So we have seen communities' resilience and using indigenous knowledge basically to fight the virus. Since the lockdown, markets were affected really, especially for the farmers trying to transport their various produce from their markets. I spoke to one farmer who turned to social media to sell his produce, who sells from eastern part of Kenya. So with the COVID-19 and the cultural change, especially how people operate, for example, issues to do with the barriers, the Kenyan government and a youth task to stop people from attending the barriers in huge numbers, because barriers in Kenya are seen as a rite of passage. So to tell people that only 15 people should attend the barriers was a huge task for people to contain that. But with time, we saw an understanding of the guidelines, and now people are taking this directive seriously. Although there were some incidences, for example, in Western Kenya, where a popular musician died, and when he was being buried, so many people wanted to storm the family burial of their kin, and that one escalated a lot of chaos in the region. Generally, there has been a lot of changes here and there in terms of access to markets. One thing that changed was the lockdown was eased from 10-hour curfew to 7 hours in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And this has seen the rise of various businesses opening up.
Oh, good. So it sounds like the economy's coming back a little bit more then too. Great.
Yeah, sure.
So Joseph, tell us what's the latest there in Ghana. How are you doing in regards to, are you still under lockdown or what's the situation there? Joseph, you need to unmute.
Okay, there you go.
There you
So, Ghana recorded its first case in early March. As at last night, when the president addressed the nation to update everybody, the indication is that more than 11,000 cases have been recorded now. About 54 deaths have been recorded for a population of about 30 million people. There's a lot of aggressive testing that's happening. More than 150,000 to 160,000 plus tests have been done. A number of us have all subjected ourselves to the testing and all, just to be sure that we are COVID-free or otherwise. Once in a while, the results delay in coming and all. And mainly that has been the general concern. There was a lockdown period in the regional capital, Accra, and surrounding areas, as well as the second biggest city, Kumasi, and surrounding areas, for a period of 3 weeks back in April. After that, things have not exactly returned to normal. Schools remained closed for quite a while until today. Then schools resumed for final year university students to return to class sometime next week. Final year senior high school students will be returning. And then there is a limited reopening of church services and all. The conversation has been huge. Over the weekend as well, we got the disclosure that the health minister here in Ghana, Kweku Agyeman-Manu, had tested positive for the virus and was recovering in a health facility here in Accra. A local mayor who was in charge of more like the third biggest city in Ghana, the secondary Takoradi area, actually died late last week. And the indication is that he died as a result of COVID-19. And so there's been bits and pieces of very terrible news with regards to the virus, but generally there's more like a strong eagerness to get the economy reopened going forward. And so that is being pursued aggressively, with people being encouraged to social distance and to clean up their hands, even as schools reopen and churches reopen and all.
I think that desire to get the economy going seems like it's a worldwide push now. So tell us a little bit about how are people feeling about the virus there? Are they frightened or are they worried? And what kind of conspiracy theories have you heard around the virus in Ghana?
And so mainly at the start of the conversation, sometime in March, before we recorded our cases and all, and even throughout the period that there was the lockdown over the 3-week duration in some parts of the nation, then you got the sense people really were scared of it and were apprehensive. But then as time progressed, people are really seeing it as virtually normal. There's been the directive that people should wear their masks. A lot of it is not happening when you step out there on the street. There's been a lot of conspiracy theories. In fact, a gentleman was arrested and he's been put before court for circulating on social media that COVID-19 doesn't exist and that it's something that was thrown out there by the executive arm of government just to frighten people. And that, in fact, the gentleman in the video was encouraging people to disregard the directive the president had given in terms of banning public gatherings and all. The video went out there on social media for quite a while, but then eventually he was apprehended by the security agencies and he's been put before court. I'm sure a lot of folks may have seen that there is a video of a man of God which went viral in several parts of Africa, linking COVID-19 to the 5G technology. And this is a man of God who is actually based in South Africa. He is Nigerian, but he has very huge following in several parts of Ghana. And so when he put out what was actually a PowerPoint presentation, essentially making the point that COVID-19 is part of efforts to promote technologies like 5G, it went viral not only on Facebook, not only on on WhatsApp, but then in other places. And what it has resulted in has been a situation of media houses, for example, stepping up to the plate and trying to help counter the misinformation and conspiracy theories. So the organization that I work with, for example, Joy News, which runs a major TV station, a radio station, and a major online platform, has rolled out a project aimed at countering misinformation on COVID-19. And so we isolate some of the statements of misinformation, you know, put it out there on TV and on social media and get the experts to counter it and explain that as it's being put out, that's not exactly what it is. And so it's the whole conspiracy theories and all have generated some pushback from the media as well, trying to set the record straight. And so those have been some of the conversations, claims, for example, that there's a way of testing for COVID-19, which involves holding your breath for a period of 5 seconds. And if you're able to do that, then it means you are COVID-19 free, has also been circulating out there, or which the scientific community and some media houses have been making the efforts to counter so that people are not misinformed.
Well, it's great to hear that there is this active effort to counter that kind of misinformation. So that's good. Nkechi, what about you? What are some of the conspiracy theories that you've seen around the virus there in Nigeria?
So there are a lot going around when it comes to conspiracy theories, but the major one is basically that it's put out there. I make reference to the man of God that Joseph just mentioned. He was talking about that it's linked to 5G technology, which is a ploy, man-made, to get people to take vaccines, which is inevitably going to lead to the enthronement of the new world order, which is going to make, which is going to usher in the Armageddon, the end of. So he went on in the video to ask people not to be wary of the vaccine. It's most of the conspiracy theories going on in Nigeria is centered around the new world order and maybe the linking of 5G, the 5G technology, which we in Nigeria, we've not rolled out the 5G technology yet. So that's the gap in that claim, because we know we ran a test. There was a trial of the 5G technology. It was test run in Nigeria, and they are now trying to put up a report as to what the project was like. Now, there is also another video that was circulated in WhatsApp, where we had a cleric in the north telling people that there is nothing like coronavirus, that it's a scam by the government, so they should just not worry. He was telling the congregants, actually, it's like in a religious gathering. He was talking and he was making reference that coronavirus is not real. Now, after that video, which misinformed the people,
Like Nkechi's having a little signal there.
that we saw another video online. Just, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you again.
Okay. Now, after that video went viral, shortly after that, there was a spike in the number of cases recorded in that part of the country. Now the government had to draft in more health personnel to help contain the situation. So in terms of, conspiracy theories, we have quite a number of them. There is also this conspiracy, this theory that by another guy that claimed to have worked with a telecom company, who also linked his conspiracy theory to the 5G technology, most of them circle around the 5G. But and then he claimed that it's also a grand plan to also usher in the new world order. But all this will also measures when the government comes out to tell people to disregard that, that it's more of misleading the public in terms of taking precautionary measures when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic.
Well, it's good to hear too that your government's being active in correcting that misinformation, letting people know that they shouldn't be listening to that. So Mamie, let's talk a little bit about, let's move to Kenya and hear a little report on what's happening with the availability of food in Kenya in the middle of the pandemic.
Well, food security is still a major issue that the government guidelines are really supporting towards boosting food production. This week we saw government read the budget, and out of that budget, which was about 2.7 trillion budget, 53 billion was dedicated to agriculture. And this one, if you compare it with the 2019-2020 budget last year, which was red, it was allocated 58 billion. So there is a big discrepancy, and the government sources say that the argument is that the government has collected less revenue because of the COVID. So in response, Ministry of Agriculture has taken care of that and ensuring that the budget reaches the common farmer in the villages. One issue that they have done was to introduce e-voucher, whereby 200,000 farmers will benefit from e-voucher. So e-voucher means that the farmers will be able to receive cash donations from the government, so that they can go ahead and buy the inputs. Secondly, the inputs has also been subsidized, almost zero-rating seed cost. So in the near future, we are likely to see less cost of seed, which is a major issue. Remember that in Kenya, we've been affected mostly with floods, killing so many farmers, as well as wiping some farms. Secondly, there was an issue of locust, which invaded farms. I talked to one farmer in eastern part of Kenya, whose farming watermelon was wiped out by desert locust. So he was surprised that the locust could feed on his farm completely, and the seed, the watermelon, and not reached harvest stage. So it was a complete loss. Another farmer I spoke to talked about his livestock being affected by the desert locust. There was a huge reduction of milk, and also he lost some cattle as well because of the locust feeding on vegetation, and herders use this vegetation to feed on their cattle.
Oh, so it's been such bad timing to have the COVID coming at the same time, as you mentioned, with the floods and the locusts. So they've kind of created this perfect storm of food shortages. So Kenya's getting ready to import some maize to help supplement the food supply there. Are there any other efforts that are underway to try to bring in additional food, or will that maize import probably take care of the problem?
Well, the government, through the Ministry of Finance, allowed importation of 4 million bags, 2 million of consumable maize, and 2 million bags of yellow maize, which was supposed to be to make livestock feeds. The consignment is underway, and sources say that the maize will be arrived in the country anytime from this mid-June. So the government, apart from importing, through the county government, they established food security war room, whereby they are collecting data, real-time data from various county sources, so that they can know which counties is producing which commodity, and then After knowing that information, then they can share among various counties. Secondly, the Ministry of Agriculture has issued several guidelines with partners such as FAO to ensure that farmers use kitchen garden so that they can grow small crops to feed their families.
Mm-hmm. Good. That sounds like a good approach. Hey, Joseph, let's hear from you. What's happening with the food supply there in Ghana in the midst of this pandemic? Unmute.
Okay, there you go. So just as we've seen in Nigeria and Kenya, the impact has been quite huge. So for example, during the period when there was the lockdown, then it was a very big issue because there was a lot of panic buying even after government announced plans for the lockdown. And market surveys show that food prices skyrocketed somewhere between 30 and 50% on the average. Some major staples, for example, skyrocketed up to 100% in terms of how much they were going for. And during the period of lockdown, yes, although we had a situation where markets were exempt and food stores were open, the prices had gone up to the extent that people were finding it, quite difficult buying some of those produce and all. Not just that, there's also the potential impact going into the future because, for example, when you look at the seed industry specifically, I've been engaging the folks that run the sector, and we all know that there's a lot of push to get farmers to adopt more of improved seeds in terms of what they plant on the fields because the yields are a lot higher. And there are complaints about how the nation got shut down sometime in March, just ahead of the planting season, when importation was being done for improved seeds, and so then they couldn't come in. Commercial flights are not getting in, and so those who want to bring in improved seeds, we happen to import quite a large chunk of that. We happen to have a situation where now they need to come in on cargo flights from the National Seed Trade Association. That has also resulted in prices going up somewhere between 20 and 30%. Some have not been able to bring in the improved seeds. The local companies that work on improved seeds, for example, they are not getting the needed labor to get it done because of lockdown restrictions. That also posing some impact. And then farmers are being virtually forced to go back to their own seeds to replant instead of going in for the improved seeds, which obviously will reduce productivity. Ghana averagely spends about $100 million every month importing various agricultural produce, again, because of the lockdown. That is not happening. And we've seen a situation where there is huge impact on a lot of our major cash crops that we export. So for example, cashew, cocoa is being negatively hit. I did the journey over like a 6-7 hour duration to a place called Sampa, which is in the Bono region in Ghana, where they grow a lot of cashew for export. And we're seeing a situation where there isn't a lot of cashew processing happening. A lot of it is mainly for export, but because of lockdown, because of COVID-19, the processing facilities are closing down in Asia and elsewhere. And so there is a glut on the market. And when you convert it into dollar terms, $100 kilogram of cashew that could ordinarily go for anywhere around $170 is being sold at half the price by farmers because they need to get them out of their store. So this is hitting them badly and their incomes are being negatively impacted. The cocoa board, which manages the cocoa sector, is also worried that they would have to cut down on how much they buy cocoa from farmers, also as a result of the glut, because a lot of the processing plants are closed internationally and are not processing, raising questions about the need for Ghana to ensure that for a lot of our cash crops, we put in the necessary measures to process them locally rather than selling them without any form of processing. And so those have been the very negative impacts. The rains have started now. We look forward to see how the maneuvering will be done so that farmers are still able to get access to improved seeds to actually plant. and so that particularly going into later in the year, food security is not negatively hit, which government says they are putting in the necessary measures to bring under control.
Mm. So you've got this combined problem of food security shortages because just getting food to the people who need it and an inability to import food. At the same time, farmers are losing money because their cash crops can't get out. Are people in the West and other countries going to see higher prices for things like chocolate and cashew because of this breakdown in the production line?
So the sad part is that chances are that for those who do a lot of the consumption of these cocoa products and cashew products, will rather see the benefits of it in terms of benefiting from fairly low prices of some of these produce. That's if the processing industry passes it on to them, because the problem is that on the international markets, the prices of these commodities are falling. And so the processing companies are buying them at a much lower rate than they would buy, which is why the farmer is being hit negatively. And so we end up creating a system where if the processing companies in the Netherlands, in America, in Germany would want to pass on the benefit of buying the raw materials to their consumers, then their consumers would end up buying at a lower price, or then the processing companies, eventually when they reopen, will make windfall profits because they are buying the very primary commodity at very low prices. So that then now will probably be the time for all the companies that are involved in activities to ensure fair trade, will probably have to step in and ensure that even as the produce are sold on the international markets, more benefits of it are piped down to the farmers right here locally. But the likely impact again on consumers in the West going forward of produce like cocoa and cashew is that when the farmers are unable to make good money this year, next year they will not invest in some of those produce. And what that will mean is that going into next year, then a lot less of those commodities will be available on the international market. And what that will mean is that the prices of them will skyrocket, and those consuming some of these produce in the West would have to pay higher prices for it. And so we may be feeling the impact of it in terms of farmers on this side of the Atlantic Ocean today, but tomorrow those in the West would be faced with the negative impact and the reality of it, that these restrictions and COVID-19's impact is actually real to a very large extent that we all need to look out for going forward.
Yeah, I think this whole pandemic really raises that issue of how interconnected our food supply is, and that this is not something that's just going to be resolved in a month or two. It's going to have very far-reaching impacts with some big winners and some big losers as this process goes along. Nkechi, let's talk a little bit about Nigeria. It's got a huge population. How are you doing in terms of feeding the people, or not you personally, but how is Nigeria doing in terms of feeding people and keeping the food supply going during this pandemic?
So right now, when the federal government announced the lockdown, he also rolled out some measures that will help in making sure we still have food, especially for the underprivileged in the society. Now, when the government announced the lockdown, in his speech, he also gave instructions for the National Grain Research Institute to give out about 70,000 grains to farmers. And then that there was also another directive from the president for 60,000 grains to be released to farmers too. Then apart from giving out palliatives by the federal government, which the underprivileged people were giving conditional cash transfer to make sure they are able to at least get the basic needs during the lockdown period, which was under $100 for each month. The federal government directed for the distribution of about 15,000 metric tons of grains that were confiscated sometime by the Nigerian customs. Okay, the federal government also gave directive for the moratorium for 3 months for there is a scheme that's going on. We have the one that's called the trader money. We have the one called the market money, and then we have the farmer money. So it's in a bid to make sure that the farmers have access to money and grain. Then we also have the state governments taking also initiative of giving out palliatives to the underprivileged. Each state government has its own project, also meant targeted at getting across to the underprivileged, those who the lockdown is going to bite more. Now, apart from that, we also have, we are also planting some of the grains that were given out by the Minister of Science and Technology, also told NAFDA to also make improved seeds available to farmers in Nigeria. So those are some of the initiatives by the government to make sure farmers have something to plant to get back and make sure we have food for the people. Even though, I was talking to a farmer recently, and she was saying that we are going to have food shortages despite all this effort by the federal government. Because apart from what the federal government is trying to do, our farming, which is basically low key, but it's not mechanized per se. We import most of the things we use to farm. We import some set of fertilizers, we import seeds, and then we import the pesticides, insecticides that are used by farmers. Now, with the lockdown, which came around the time of the planting season was about to commence, it's now farmers to assess those things because the agribusiness people were unable to restock before the lockdown was put in place. So it's kind of a tricky situation where the government is making effort, but because of our huge population, this is going to have a bite later in the future, which is going to inevitably is going to lead to shortages, which is going to lead to a spike in prices of this food stuff in the future.
Yeah, it sounds like a difficult situation. And then when you mentioned the, access to improved seeds and fertilizers and things like this, this happened at a time when Nigeria was getting ready to roll out its GMO, its BT cowpea, which is of course such an important food crop in West Africa. So tell us a little bit about how has that rollout been affected by the pandemic? Are farmers still able to get that pest-resistant seed, or are they, is that on hold right now, or what's going on?
Rollout of the BT cowpea was affected because the plan of the federal government, we were already in motion to release these seeds to the farmers. The intention of the government was to have farmers plant this improved cowpea in this 2020 planting season. But because of the lockdown, farmers, the relevant organizations were unable to get the certification of this crop. So this means that even though farmers are eager to plant this, this seed, they are unable to have it. They are unable to get it across to farmers. They are unable to get through the final process of certifying the seeds before it is released to the farmers. Because before now, they have already started teaching farmers the best farm practices that will help them in planting the seeds. Then seed companies have also been brought on board for the multiplication and distribution of these seeds. So all these preparations was stalled when the lockdown was now announced by the federal government. So sadly, even though we want to plant the BT cowpea in this planting season, the COVID-19 lockdown has affected it. So we have missed this planting season because it's raining already, farmers are already planting. So it's probably going to be another planting season from the way I see it.
Mm-hmm. So there's another crop that's going to be another food crop that can potentially be having increased shortages because of the losses that the farmers suffer from the traditional cowpea. You know, we had a question here from Facebook, and so I'll let you answer first, Nkechi, since you're on. And so if this is Chris who's saying, please ask the panelists to respond to the police brutality occurring in their countries while enforcing the lockdowns. In April, the Nigeria Human Rights Commission reported that security forces were killing more people than coronavirus, with 18 killed by police and 12 killed by corona in that time. And then there was also a killing in Kenya. So tell us a little bit about what's the police response been in terms of enforcing the lockdown, and has there been resistance from the population to police brutality, the sort of protests that we're seeing in the US and Western countries? So tell us a little bit about that, Nkechi.
So in Nigeria, the people who feel the bite of the lockdown are the people on the lower cadre of the public. So these people are the people who feel that it's better to be out there to get things done, to source for livelihood, than stay home and die of hunger. So no matter how much they want to stay home, they have to go out there to get something to eat. So now this is a friction between the police, who are the law enforcement people, and the people who feel they have to go out to eat, or it's a tricky situation where trying to balance between staying safe and eating. So these things is just a spill-off of the lockdown in trying to enforce, the government directive to stay home and stay safe, and then trying to make sure that people go out there and then eat. So this led to agitations by the people, which inevitably led the government to ease down a little bit on the low-income earners, which the directive now came that people can go out, the neighborhood markets can open for a regulated time between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. so that it gives an avenue for people to go out and look forward to eat and then come home. So yes, there are situations like that, but it's a tricky situation between following the government directive and then surviving.
Yeah, it's a tough choice, very tough choice. Mamie, let's hear a little bit from Kenya in terms of, many people in Africa and other parts of the world do depend on day labor just to get enough food each day to survive. They have to work each day to get food. They don't have money saved. They don't have a pantry full of food like they have in the US. So tell us a little bit about, how people are responding and how the police are responding to, at that end of the economic scale where people are a little more desperate, as Nkechi was pointing out.
Well, I think in Kenya also there are similarities with Nigeria. Majority of people, especially in informal settlements, for example, in slums like Kibera, which is one of the largest slums in Africa, people there really depend on a daily basis work to feed for their family. So their families has been affected in terms of food access and the lockdown. Initially the lockdown was for 10 hours. the curfew hour was for 10 hours. So, at 7 p.m. already people are going at home, and the police presence were all over, are trying to contain them, especially to be at their own homes or in their jobs. So because most of them walk to the cities and walk back to their houses, there was time difference. And some of them, we saw a bit of police brutality, beating citizens because if they stay in their own house, then they will not be able to feed their families. And some of them that you have interviewed, some of the people that you have interviewed said they are battling between dying of hunger and dying of COVID-19. So those issues were there, and police were saying that they use force to contain the residents because they don't want to fill the prison with these people, and because they can escalate the COVID-19 spread.
Right, exactly. I think we always see it's always the poorest people that suffer the most in these situations. So Joseph, tell us a little bit about, Ghana in regard to, are there conflicts with the police? Was there repressive action in enforcing the lockdown? How are people responding there?
So in a place called Ashaiman in Ghana, a gentleman was shot by the military in the efforts to enforce the lockdown. He was actually killed because the claim was that he was skipping the lockdown and, they had to go after him, and it resulted in him being killed. The community got angry. They massed up, and that came with its own challenges because when the community massed up in response, then there was no social distance. No one was protecting themselves, even as they demonstrated and protested that particular killing, with the MP leading the processes and all. Not just that, just a few days ago, there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Accra by one of the groups, and the leadership of the group was actually arrested by police, and the gentleman has been put before court because then the point is that in leading the demonstration, they acted in a way that breached restrictions and breached protocols when it comes to social distancing to avoid COVID-19 and all, because Parliament has actually passed a new act here in Ghana called the Restriction of Imposition Act, which the president has issued an executive instrument to back on the restrictions. So this gentleman and a few others were demonstrating, and in the course of the demonstration, there was the arrest. The case is before court. They insist they had put in all the necessary protocols. And not just that, even myself, personally, I got arrested by the police during the lockdown period, because then there were issues about movement and all, which eventually got resolved a few hours later at the police station. So there's been bits and pieces of that in terms of brutalities and all. Some of them have ended up in courts. People have been fined, which is the due process and all, and people have been put in prison. But there's been bits and pieces of the brutalities that have been meted out by the security agencies and all, even till date, with the conversation ongoing on Black Lives Matter and the police using COVID-19 related restrictions to insist that people shouldn't converge and avoid some of those situations with protest and all.
Well, I'm sorry to hear you got arrested, Joseph, but I'm glad that you got out pretty quickly too.
It was fixed after 3 or 4 hours. It only required a level-headed conversation. So it goes back to the point about the police overreaching and overacting, and sometimes not being reasonable enough. But eventually that was fixed after about 3 hours.
Okay, I think we've all become more aware of the instances of police overreacting and missing that reasonable conversation, which leads to another question we have from one of our audience, Ian Gazard, who's asking, and we'll start with you, Joseph, since you're on the screen, and that is, so with the lockdowns, we know that people have, it's an effort by government to try to stop the spread of this virus, particularly in cities where people live close together. And, that's had problems with police repression as well as economic impacts. But tell us about some of the government initiative or one government initiative that has been effective in really addressing the pandemic in Ghana.
I saw that question from Ian on the platform. A very interesting question. For example, the Minister for Food and Agriculture was in Parliament about 2 weeks ago, and there was a question to him about the need for government to roll out what some groups in Ghana have called for and what some MPs have called for, an emergency, a food security emergency preparedness plan in relation to COVID-19 and even going forward. And the minister outlined what he said is a policy that the government is implementing, which includes trying to boost local food production as a way to help ensure long-term food sustainability, even when such pandemics hit, and governments rolling out necessary measures to ensure that the inputs that go into production, like fertilizers, like pesticides, like improved seeds, are locally done. The minister again indicated that that effort is ongoing and that they are expanding on not just processing plants, but also warehouses where they can keep food in the long term for difficult moments and all. He elaborately laid out what he described as that emergency food preparedness plan and indicated that he was going to submit it to Parliament so that then MPs are aware of it. The only problem with the plan, as he outlined, is that only himself and his people are aware of it, and it's not out there for third parties to do the necessary interrogation. He promised Parliament he will let them have it the week after, which hasn't happened yet, so we are looking forward to it. So that looked like a reasonable way around it, building local capacity, so that then when the borders have to be locked and people have to stay in their local vicinities to control a pandemic, then they can still have access to food and all. So localizing food production is what the minister has advocated for. We all wait to see how that gets rolled out eventually, so we don't have some of these challenges emerging going into the future.
Good. Mimi, what about you? What's one initiative that the Kenyan government has come up with that in response to this that you think has been particularly effective or helpful?
Well, the Ministry of Health, what it has done really, it has empowered people in terms of information flow, and they are sharing constant information in terms of how you are supposed to conduct yourself during this COVID-19. But then there is also the rise of citizen journalism, whereby people are reporting cases. For example, people who are traveling from cities to their village, and then citizens would report that case to the chief, who is a government representative. Then the government representative effects various measures that has been implemented, but has been issued by the government. So we have seen the rise of citizen journalism, people becoming more responsive with information, and also putting the government to the task. But then also in terms of food production as well, the government has been proactive in terms of issuing various guidelines on how basically food can be distributed from one area to another. There was an issue of exports. For example, government has a lot of emphasis on exports, especially on flour exports, which is a very essential commodity. So the government, through various ministries, distributed flours to UK residents for free, especially those ones who have been affected by the COVID-19, because they are the markets, they are the consumers of the flowers. So some of the Kenyans received the news with, were happy about it, others were very angry about it. But then this incident supported farmers in one way or the other, because their flowers were bought by the government to be distributed to the various residents of UK.
Mm-hmm. An interesting approach. Yeah, one way to deal with that problem. So Nkechi, what about you? We had a question that was directed to you that said, this must be from a Nigerian who says, so far Nigerians believe COVID-19 is a scam by the government. So what's your take on that? I think we heard a little bit of that previously, but maybe you could work into that. What's an initiative that the government of Nigeria has done that has been effective in addressing COVID?
The take that COVID-19 is not real, it's obviously a farce. Because if you take a tour, I think one of the first victims of the virus was the chief of staff of our president, who is a very highly placed official who died of COVID-19 complications.
Mm.
Now, apart from that, we've had even state governors come out to say that they are positive to the virus and who have had to go to self-isolation. And there was a recent case of a media mogul, the owner of African Independent Television, whose son traveled and came back and was positive to the virus. And when he was tested, the whole family was tested. The family of about 7 were positive to the virus. So they had to take them to the isolation center for treatment. And then they recovered and they were released. Mm-hmm. Issues that coronavirus is calm is out of the question. Now, you know, even though people are coming up with the myth that Africa is too hot for the virus and things like that, it is still real because the number keeps increasing and the number of deaths keep growing. Mm-hmm. As of today, I think we have over 400 deaths mm-hmm. from the virus. So where are the deaths coming from if it's not real?
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's just a ploy to maybe push their own personal agenda. This is a global situation that every nation is currently grappling with. So to take precautionary measures should be the watchword in this mm-hmm. situation.
So Nkechi, why do you think that Africa has had a lower number of cases than places like the United States, Brazil, you know, China, Italy? You know, why do you think Africa has been able to keep its cases down?
Okay, personally, I think in Africa, we are still dealing with the issues of malaria, mm-hmm. unlike the Western world, where they have done away with issues like this. So mm-hmm. I believe our immune system is still very used to fighting off, you know, flu and, you know, fever and all this, mm-hmm. unlike the Western world where that's an age-long story. That's mm-hmm. one of the first things I think is helping Africa deal with this issue. The second issue is the experience they have gathered from the Ebola issue, the Ebola epidemic. You know, during the Ebola epidemic, Nigeria was one of the countries that was able to deal with the epidemic successfully. You had issues where they've had to bring in some of the things they used with Ebola, like contact tracing, you know, and then isolation, and then opening up of more areas to keep people in isolation. So I think these 2 points, number one for me is that our immune system is still used to dealing with issues of flu, and then our experience that we have gathered from the previous epidemic, like these ones, they are still coming into play now. So it's helping the government to keep a firm grasp of the situation right now.
Mm. It's a very good point about malaria. I just recently saw a little graphic that shows the top causes of death throughout the world. And for a very long time, it was malaria, but now COVID has topped that. So I think a lot of people, as you mentioned, in the West sort of forget about malaria, but it's a very real problem in Asia and Africa. So we're just about out of time, but I want to wrap up by asking each of you to summarize by, we've heard about the bad things that have happened in terms of police repression, lockdown, food shortages, things like that, and of course, death and sickness. But what's some positive outcome that you think might come out of this? Something good that might come out for the continent or your country because of this pandemic? We'll start with you, Nkechi, and then we'll move on.
Okay. So for me, I think it's going to be the ability to open up to more technologies. You know, during the lockdown, during the COVID-19 lockdown, we've had to be forced to try to function as a society in isolation. You know, now we have meetings, virtual meetings. We still try to run governments. We still try to go out there and do things we should have done from isolation. This means that even at the end of the COVID-19, we are going to go into an era where the society can depend more on technology to function. Now, prior to now, everybody needed to be in the same venue to have a meeting. But with the advent of the coronavirus, people now can effectively meet, have virtual meetings. And then it's also going to help us be more independent when it comes to, you know, trying to get our food supply chain working. Because now, with the lockdown, people still have to eat and farmers still have to plant. Now, this has forced our local seed companies to try to, you know, fill in the gaps in terms of making sure there are enough seeds for farmers to plant. I think it's some of the things my takeaway from the pandemic.
Yeah, I think there often is some positive out of it. What about you, Mei? What do you think is something positive that might result from this whole situation there in Kenya?
Well, Kenya is almost similar to Nigeria, as Nkechi says. One of the issues that we really see is a rise of innovations. For example, I reported on Kitui County, which is producing PPEs and the local mask. So the importation of masks has been, we are importing less mask because local companies are manufacturing. So the manufacturing, which is under the Big Four agenda of the president, is being sustained. And, farmers and also various agricultural producers are using innovative ways, for example, social media to sell their produce. So we have seen people who did not necessarily were not involved in agricultural value chain getting involved. Even in some areas, we have seen the rise of car boot, people selling produce from their own cars, cutting the various elements of challenges of accessing markets.
Being innovative and getting it right to the customer and cutting out the middleman. And what about you, Joseph? What do you see as something positive that might come out of this in Ghana?
I'll tie that in directly with the question you asked Nkechi about how come COVID-19 cases in Africa are low. To give your government the credits, they've been very proactive. A lot of nations locked down even before they recorded their very first cases of COVID-19 in terms of the borders, you know, so they closed down airports, you know, as a proactive measure. Despite all its negative sides, a lot of Ghana, for example, went into lockdown when there were, if my memory serves me, just about 400 cases of COVID-19, you know, and South Africa has some of the strongest COVID-19 restrictions, although their cases are nowhere near what Italy and Germany and the US has. So I think that aside everything else that has been said, the cases are low because we've been proactive and scared, and we've rolled out the measures to get ahead of it. So it's taught us the lesson that if we take things seriously and we are proactive and we respond when we need to, we can deal with situations going forward. And I think that's a key lesson that Africa would learn, and it will inform decisions going forward. The other key thing, which I think would be a positive out of COVID-19, has been beyond the technologies, as Bernardo mentioned earlier. For example, when it comes to using local treatments to deal with the everyday challenges that we face and investing in them. I think for us in Africa, it's so much of an eye-opener. There's a lot of controversy around the medication that's emerging from Madagascar and the fact that it's not gone through the necessary processes and all, which everyone is saying, let those processes be rolled out. Even here in Ghana, following the outbreak, the herbal medicine practitioners submitted about 32 different herbal medications to the Food and Drugs Authority for assessment as to whether they can help deal with COVID-19. 19 of them got the positive response that they can. And now the conversation is that the processes have begun to get it through the necessary trials and even clinical trials and get international approval for it. So it's opening our eyes to the fact that we can come up with local remedies to deal with some of these challenges and open it up to international standards and critiques in terms of how they get adopted eventually. I think that's the other positive thing that would end up emerging. And it goes back to adequate investment in science and technology and taking indigenous African technology a lot more seriously in terms of how these challenges can be dealt with, so that tomorrow, you may never know, it may be possible that a COVID-19 medication emerging from African indigenous technology can be accepted by the CDC in the United States of America as possible treatment for COVID-19.
That's a very good point, Joseph. And it also leads to a little plug for our next program, which is going to be a conversation about Brazil, which has not been proactive and has not taken a pro-science approach, and now has the #2, right behind the US in the most COVID cases in the world. So we'll hear from Natalia Techner there about why hasn't Brazil been very proactive. But and people can find the rest of our lineup by visiting allianceforscience.cornell.edu. And I just want to thank all of you participants and our wonderful correspondents for joining us and sharing what's happening. It's been so interesting to hear from all of you, and keep doing your great reporting and be sure to stay safe. And thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
See you all again soon, I hope. Bye-bye.